my story. My story is a very simple but very complicated story. Hey, Ziggy. Um, Basically, how I came into this industry was through most, I suppose, male. Um, the same way that most males would have come through. They played lots of sport in school. Unfortunately, in school, I was always injured. So, you know, I broke every bone possible. I had multiple concussions. I had, kicks to the head. I had broken fingers. I was sick. I fell through a window, sliced up my wrist. I kind of, I kind of was always just in the wars, and that seems to have progressed with me in terms of my adulthood and in my later life, um, and it's been a blessing in disguise. From that, I've been able to find what I'm most passionate about, and that seems to be working with people, athletes, whoever, to mitigate their risk of injury as best as possible, and to kind of keep them functioning and keep them going and keep them moving as best as possible, even if that means that we have to take a step backwards to take two steps forward, and you know regress certain movements so that we can still create some form of training environment, and whatever it is. And it seems to be something that I'm really good at, not just from like a programming side, or not just finding an exercise that you're able to do, but a lot of the time it comes down to the emotional and mental side of it. Having lived through quite a few injuries myself, I've come to realize the hardship that an injury puts on you from an emotional perspective, and the the consequences of that injury, and what it can do to you as a person, and especially as an athlete. So for me, um, I suppose one of my bigger injuries to start with was in my final year of school. I was hit in the back of the head with a knee in a sports game. Um, and a very long story short from that is I landed up with a bit of brain damage. So at that point in time, I'd taken quite a few hits to the head, and the knock-on effect, excuse the pun, created a very, very high concussion syndrome, to the point where it was very difficult for me to remember what had happened the day before, and up to about 6 to 8 months prior to the injury as well, I had trouble remembering what had occurred. So that was my first, I suppose, introduction to major injury. Um, from a perspective, I was playing a high level of sport at the time, and this injury stopped me from continuing in the sport. Um, and unfortunately, I think at that time I was just a bit too young and naive, and my knee-jerk reaction was, well, I don't want to go into exercise science, and I don't want to go into sport. And that's what I did. I completely rejected it, and I went into I call it a similar field, because I see personal training and strength and conditioning and coaching as the people business, as a business in terms of human interaction and connection, and connecting with people. So I naturally progressed to emergency medicine, so as a paramedic, and I found myself on the front lines in South Africa in a very interesting environment. Um, at the same time, still trying to pursue some form of physical endeavors, because being physically fit, obviously, one, it's just been ingrained in me, and two, it would help us within the jobs that we were doing. Um, and while I was on that path, I started to realize that I had digressed from what I really wanted to do, and that was being involved in sport and coaching and physical exercise. And I slowly started making my way back to that environment, where I was lucky enough to be able to study while I worked, and then also just found some internships and found some some avenues that allowed me to kind of drive and pursue this passion. And from that, I found, I continued my love of strength sports, which brought me into powerlifting and weightlifting, which I then devoted myself into, and did relatively well at it. Took me about 2-3 years. Managed to get the call-ups for the South African squad for Commonwealth in 2015 for powerlifting. And at the time of the call-up, I had been diagnosed with a labrum tear. So for people who don't know what a labrum tear is, basically a labrum, or it was labrum of the left hip. But the labrum is basically a shock absorber within the hip cavity that stops the head of femur from smashing up into the bone. So it sits on the inside over here. And looking back on that now, I start to already see how I was molding my passion and love for injuries and working around injuries and working with people with injuries, because I had to adapt. I had 6 months to prep, or continue my prep, I suppose, dealing with quite a devastating injury. And at that time, I made do. I made sure that I could still squat. I made sure that I could still deadlift. I incorporated different means, and I did different things. There was a point in my one training cycle where, from the paramedic side, I had access to an analgesic gas, so basically like a pain-killing gas. And as stupid as it sounds, what I ended up doing is I'd sit in front of my squat rack with it was a bright orange canister, and I'd take a hit of this gas, or Entonox, quickly run over. It would last 30 seconds, 45 minutes. Run over to the squat rack, do my squat, rack it, come back and sit down. And that allowed me to, it was probably very unhealthy for me at the time, but it allowed me to get my squat training in and manage the pain at the time. And it's like, thinking about it now and looking back on it, that was very stupid. And I don't suggest anyone goes and does that at any stage. But that's the commitment that I was willing to do, and that was part of the process of what I had to learn. So, anyways, I went to Commonwealth. I did averagely okay, and I came back and I had the first surgery to repair it. And around that first surgery, I continued to try and train, and I started working ways to be able to train, mostly upper body at that stage, and going through my rehabilitation. And unfortunately, things just didn't align, and the surgery was deemed, I suppose, a failure. I rejected the anchors that they had used to put into the hip to help keep the labrum up there so they could bind with the bone again. So I was booked in for my second repair and a revision. So they went in and did that, and it seemed to be okay at the time. And I started, the rehabilitative process again, and this is about 4 months down the line, with my sights set on basically coming back to powerlifting and coming back to being able to weightlift and compete at a national level again, and compete for the rest of my life. That was kind of, as much as it shouldn't have been, powerlifting was my identity. And that's part of what I hope to be able to speak about from this is how the identity or something becoming an identity is both good and very dangerous. Because without that entity or that identity, you feel very lost and very not you, unfortunately, when you've put such a hierarchy on that one thing. So I continued through the rehabilitative process of that, and something just wasn't right. And it got to the point where I was experiencing pain that I cannot describe to anyone. I never will be able to describe to anyone, because it was so severe. I couldn't lie still in bed without being in excruciating pain. And it was a very difficult time in my life. Um, and it was very difficult to try and explain to those around me, my family, my support system, because I became very just depressed, and it took everything out of me to be able to just function because I was in so much pain. No matter what I did, I felt pain. It was there. I could get no relief from it. I'd go to bed, basically crying myself to sleep because I knew that the next morning I'd have to face this pain again, and that there was no resolve from that side. And um, it was very rough from that perspective of I had so many people around me, but no one could understand or no one could help me. And it was probably the most frustrating thing as both an athlete and just a human being is being in an amount of pain that there was no resolve. Like, no one had an idea of what to do. No one could tell me what was wrong. I was in and out of various different tests, different doctors' rooms, MRIs, CT scans, injections, you name it. And there was just no relief. It got to the point where one night I sat there and I was just like, this isn't worth it. This really, really isn't worth it. And it's not something that I think that's ever crossed my mind from that side. And I hope this comes across as, I hope this helps someone trying to identify with pain. But I unfortunately, at the time, I lived in South Africa. I carried a gun for personal protection at that time, and there was definitely times where, I looked at it and I said, that's the only way that I can end this pain. And yeah, I'm glad that I had the power to not, because it would have been an easy option for me. And I can see how it is an easy option. I can see how it's when you've gone so far down that rabbit hole of being in pain for so long and not having any type of cure or ability to find some kind of resolve. I can easily see how you just pick it up and you do what needs to be done. And I'm just lucky that I had a really good, mom and dad who were constantly concerned about me. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure why I didn't. Because I think it got close. It definitely got close at times. And I'm just glad that I never did. Don't think I've ever really told anyone that. Anyways, from there I eventually got a second opinion out of South Africa over here in Australia. And basically what long story short from it is I started having what's called AV necrosis of the head of femur. So the head of femur, or the femur itself, wasn't receiving enough blood flow supply. So what it started doing is it started going into a necrosis and starting to die, basically. So I was rotting from the inside, I suppose. And at the age of 23, I had a full hip replacement. Not something you really think would ever happen to you at that age. And man, I was just being tested. The universe was like, we're going to throw everything at you to put you in the position that you currently are in. And through that hip, I remember coming straight out of the surgery and being in so much pain from the operation, but that overall pain, or that pain that I was experiencing from whatever it was, the AV necrosis, whatever it was gone. And I could feel that there was a different pain. I didn't care that it was painful from, having the bone chopped off or being worked on. It was a different pain. And I was like, I can live with this. I can do this. I can move on. I can, like, I can just go ahead and I can make this happen. And I started the rehabilitation process from that side, and man, that was another challenge in itself. But in saying that, that rehabilitative process allowed me to really dive into the space and the field of um, adaptive training, and starting to find different ways that you can still create a similar stimulus, and working around injuries and the mental perspective of, I went back to squatting, for example, and I remember the day that I squatted a 5 kilogram plate. A goblet squatted a 5 kilogram plate, and it was like I got more joy from that than hitting a 220 squat on the platform. Like that's how amazing it was. And I every time I work with athletes now, I work with general pop or disabled athletes or whatever it is, and I see that spark in their eye after we've managed to rig a system up, or whatever we've managed to create a movement pattern that they didn't think that they could get into. I see that spark, and I remember that feeling, and that's been an amazing thing for me. And without having gone through this injury, I don't think I would never appreciate or fully appreciate what that's like to people. So that was a long recovery, and about a year to 18 months post operation or post full hip replacement, I was back to squatting under a barbell. And that felt so good. I had a bit of pain about 18 months later in the quad, and to me that was fine. Like, I could handle that. There was nothing. I could just carry on. I could live my life. I could kind of run, which was more of a hobble, to be honest. I could move. I was moderately pain free, and I just had life back, which was amazing for me from that side. And I remember walking into the surgeon's office for my 2-year checkup, and for the last, I don't know, 4 weeks prior to that, had been having a pain in the quad and kind of up into hip flexor region. It was just uncomfortable, and I was like, man, it just feels a little bit shitty, and let's just get this checkup over and done with, and then I can I'll go see the sports therapist and kind of get it loosened, and we can kind of take it from there. And I sat down in the surgeon's chair, and he looked up at me, and he started crying. And when he started crying, I just, like, my whole heart sank, and I just, like, teared up. And I just knew something was wrong. And basically what had happened is I had what's called prosthetic loosening, where the prosthetic hasn't bound with the bone correctly, and it's now started to increase the space within the head within the femur and start coming loose. And that was actually why I was starting to have all that pain into my leg and up the hip flexor. Was basically the body started rejecting the implant. And I remember leaving the hospital devastated. And I got in my car, and I remember driving away from the hospital, and it, my dad lived in Australia at the time, and I remember phoning him because he's also had a full hip replacement from other for other reasons, I suppose. And I remember phoning him, and he answered the phone, and I was just in tears, and I just said, I've got to go through this again. And I don't, at the time, I remember the feeling perfectly. Like, it was like I'm experiencing it now. I sat there in my car honestly not knowing if I could do this, if I could go through it again, and it was devastating to me. And I drove around for 20, 30 minutes, just crying, not knowing where I was going, not knowing what I was going to do. Um, and I somehow landed up at the rehab center that was looking after my rehabilitation. And I walked into the center, and I turned the corner, and all of the bios and physios and basically everyone that was there was standing there. And I walked in, and I just collapsed. Um, and I I just couldn't believe that I had to do this all over again, and it was frightening. I didn't want to have to go through the pain. I didn't want to have to go through the last 2 years worth of rehab. Like, it just felt like everything that I'd done was for nothing. Like, it was for nothing. Um, and man, it was probably the hardest day of my life. That day sucked. Being told you have to go through everything that you've done all over again. It was rough, and it hurt more than anything. And the second surgery was then booked, and I landed up going through and having the operation done. And with that, there was a few more complications where I had the psoas or iliopsoas tendon was then rubbing against the implant, so I was then booked back in about 4 weeks post that second surgery, and the psoas was then released, is what they call it. So they basically create a little slice in the psoas so that it can move freely, and at the same time, it was found out that I had something called, what is it called? They call it MO. It's myositis or whatever it is. Basically, what it is, it's your body's amazing way of your body turning muscle into, or calcifying muscle, or turning it into bone, because it's received too much trauma. So our bodies are amazing from that perspective. It basically decided that it had enough. There was way too much trauma that had been placed under this one area or joint, and it was going to calcify the muscles around there. So I landed up having to go through some radiation and some radiation therapy just to slow that down and stop that, which was then done whenever it was 2 and 4 weeks post that second operation, and from there my rehabilitative process could begin again. And it was tough. I mean, it's coming up on now, I think in 3 months' time it'll be 2 years again. And to say it's been easy would be a lie, especially considering in the last 6 to 8 months I have had it checked up, and there's once again signs of some form of rejection or some form of loosening occurring towards the upper part of the stem, which means that at some stage I will have to have that third revision done a lot sooner than what it should be. And I suppose in this last period of time, I've started to be able to relate better with my clients and my athletes. And this is part of the whole story, and I suppose this is why I'm telling this is being able to draw on your own experiences and draw on what you've had to deal with and what you've gone through as a coach. Really matters to the person that you are working with. I think sometimes that matters more than the qualification that you hold. And I say that respectively. There's many smart people out there, and many people that are way more qualified than I am, and I strive to educate myself and to make sure that I have some form of intellectual capacity around the subject. But I think what a lot of coaches are missing is their actual skin in the game. Being able to say to an athlete or a coach, or being able to relate as a coach to your clients, and turn around and say, I know I have a similar, or have had a similar experience, and I understand the emotion attached to it. Not to say that you know how they feel, because no one knows exactly how another person feels, but to be able to relate to them with the experience that they are currently going through, I think is gold as a coach. And to be able to use your own experiences to identify those own experiences that you've gone through, and be able to reflect on them and help your clients going forward to go through the experiences and the feelings and the emotions that is needed, especially when it's coming off an injury, and you are trying to work your way around an injury and get yourself back to field of play. I think being able to understand the emotion that the athlete or client is going through is very big as a coach. And I think not many